All right, what's up, guys? Welcome back to another little segment here. So in the last little segment I did, I kind of just explained a little bit what the exercise tempo is and just kind of how I use it a little bit, just to give kind of the basics as to why or how to implement different contraction durations, like specifically eccentrics or isometrics, and just kind of how to say put it in a program, note it in a program. So now I want to focus a little bit more on the specific contractions, just because I think what I've learned over the last, let's say, 6 to 8 months is that each contraction has a specific role in terms of, let's say, force development, force production, so an athletic performance, and also just an overall strength. So one thing that I found that I neglected prior to the 6 to 8 months was emphasizing the different contractions, and just thinking about it and learning about the different benefits and how to use them has really changed my perspective on preparation for athletes specifically. Also personally, I've been kind of playing around with the contractions for my powerlifting goals, but many of these concepts are principally applied to athletic performance. So what are eccentrics? So I might have mentioned it in the last segment, but the eccentric muscle action is basically the yielding or the negative portion of a movement. So this is the part where the muscle is being lengthened. So a common example is, let's say, a squat. All right. The eccentric portion is the descent of the squat. So when you start at the top, you lower yourself down. That's the eccentric. For the case of, let's say, a lat pull down, it's actually the reverse, where when you're bringing the load back up, you're lengthening the lats and the back muscles, and that is considered the eccentric portion. So it's not necessarily the lowering, it's more the negative, the yielding. You're kind of releasing the weight and the tissues are lengthening. So eccentric training is essentially just training that's emphasizing the eccentric action. And kind of the reason why I added the picture, the black and white picture, is because that's a picture of one of the top bodybuilders ever, and one of my personal favorites. His name's Dorian Yates, and what he was kind of like one of the first big guys that I know of that really tried to advocate for emphasizing the negative or the eccentric. I believe he was saying that guys or people were missing out on half of the benefits of lifting weights because they were neglecting the eccentrics. So as you can see, the guy had a ridiculous amount of muscle, so the eccentric does play a critical component for that. Now, what are some of the benefits of eccentrics? So one of them is learning of proper movement patterns and kind of ingraining motor control. So Ed Cohen, I heard on a podcast recently, I believe it was Squat University. He was talking about how he would use a 10-second eccentric squat to improve his movement and his technique. What this very long eccentric motion allowed him to do was to consciously think about every portion of his body. So let's say, when you're descending, all right, how's my back feel? Is my chest up? How are my knees tracking? What do my feet feel like on the ground? You're able to spend more time consciously thinking about how you're moving. This is almost like if you think of deliberate practice. Practicing just to practice, may give you, let's say, this very small, insignificant benefit. But deliberate practice, where you're explicitly focusing on something, allows you to practice less in terms of duration, but get much better or much greater benefits from it. Another point, and if you were to take one thing from this presentation, it's this quote. You can't produce what you can't absorb. It's very simple, but I think this is a very profound statement and a very profound quote by Christian Thibodeau. So this is kind of really what changed my perspective on using different tempos and using or emphasizing different contractions. So the way I kind of like to think about it is, I like to imagine when I'm under a load, I like to imagine that I'm like a spring. All right. So what's happening is, let's say I'm loading the spring. All right, I'm compressing it. That's the eccentric portion. Now, if there's any weakness in that, let's say, what is it? Compression of the spring. All right. If there's any leakage of strength, well, the rebound, the concentric, will not be as strong had it been, let's say, fortified or stronger. So that's kind of like the way I'd like to think about it. If you're not able to handle a load eccentrically, you're not going to be able to produce it concentrically. So by emphasizing the eccentrics and strengthening it, you're essentially increasing the potential for strength gains later on. Now, there's also another connection to, let's say, more physiological, where eccentrics are a form of, or a way to desensitize the Golgi tendon organ. So the Golgi tendon organ is, it's kind of like a safety mechanism. All right, it senses pressure or forces, and what it does is, if it senses a force that's, let's say, considered unsafe, well, it shuts the system down. You're not able to concentrically produce power or strength. So one of the techniques for eccentric training is supramaximal eccentrics, and that is considered to desensitize the Golgi tendon organ. So essentially kind of shut it off a little bit, kind of shut it up a bit. So you're able to kind of increase the strength potential even further. Eccentrics, again, can also help increase the tissue's resilience. So again, similar to the you can't produce what you can't absorb. Your tissues, let's say, what's termed its load-bearing capacity. If it's not able to bear a certain load, it's not going to be able to produce it and potentially lead to injury. And then a final benefit, and it's something I've only recently kind of been accustomed to or I've seen experience, is in the rehab of tendinopathy. So I had a client of mine during the summer who had pretty bad knee issues because of an overly tight quad. So basically his quad tendon was being pulled and was leading to a lot of stiffness in his knees. So I was talking with one of the physiotherapists at the gym I work at, and what she was recommending was eccentric only work. I was a little bit confused. I was like, oh, maybe the knee, you want to get a lot of blood flow, so just purely concentric, maybe some sled work. But then after she'd said that, it kind of got me thinking a little bit. Well, eccentrics involve the lengthening of the tissue, so it kind of makes sense if you're doing eccentric only, no concentric. So essentially, you have someone help you with the concentric and you just perform the eccentric. It's a way of loading the tissue while also focusing primarily on lengthening the tissue. So I thought that was pretty interesting. I'm not a physiotherapist, so there's maybe other benefits in terms of rehabbing tendinopathies, but that's just kind of the way I was thinking about it. And if you have any other evidence, just let me know. So what are some different types of eccentric training? So there's slow eccentrics. I kind of classify those as performing an eccentric with a 4 to 6 second descent and performing the concentric at the same time. Then there's also kind of like a subset of that where they're called like super slow eccentrics. And that could be, let's say, upwards of say 20 seconds. So between 8 to 20 seconds long, right? I rarely use this, but you know, it's still something you could use. Now I put the sets and reps there. And that's really subject to change. It's very dependent on when you're using it. It also depends on the length of the eccentric. So typically, let's say if you're doing 12 reps, I wouldn't recommend doing 6-second eccentric. One, because it's going to suck. It's going to be very long. And two, you're probably not going to be able to use it like a substantial load to really kind of get the benefits of the eccentric training. So typically higher or a longer duration eccentric, less reps, shorter eccentric, more reps, just in principle. Now, a couple others, these are, say, more advanced techniques. The first one being accentuated eccentric. So this is essentially you're emphasizing the eccentric with, let's say, help or no concentric. So one of my favorite movements, or there's two kind of techniques I like to use this, are 2-in-1 movements. So you perform the concentric with 2 limbs and you perform the eccentric with 1. So you're basically able to eccentrically overload tissues on a single limb. The long lever eccentric is you're basically increasing the lever length on the eccentric and then decreasing it on the concentric. I'll show a couple examples in the next slide. But let's say for one of the exercises I use are the abs. So let's say you do a crunch. Well, on the eccentric, you would have your hands above your head to increase the lever length. And then on the concentric, you bring it in closer to your temples. And again, these are performed, let's say, between a 4 to 6 second eccentric. Now, another form of eccentric is maximal or supramaximal eccentrics. Now, this is a very advanced technique. I generally don't use it because most of my clients aren't at that level yet. But essentially what it is you perform an eccentric with between 100 to 120%. I think the literature is a little, I've seen people go over than that, but generally it's between 100 and 120% of your 1 repetition max. And you could also perform it slowly or quickly. I've seen it used both ways, but the way I prefer to use it is very, very low volume. So very typically just 1 rep with a slow eccentric. Now, there's different ways you could use this. I'm not going to go in depth on it, but you can get a little creative with this. And this is also one of the ways to override the Golgi tendon. Now, so here are the videos. The first one is the 2-in-1 eccentric. So what you'll see is I perform the leg curl with 2 legs and the eccentric with 1. It's about I think I'm doing a 5 or 6 second eccentric there. Yeah, so there you go. Now the long lever eccentric, what you'll see me do is on the eccentric, I'm gonna have my hands above my head. So we'll stop it here. If you look, there's the center of rotation. That's the length. Now, concentrically, pause it there. Concentrically, you see, it's much shorter. All right, so the concentric is going to be a lot easier. Now, another type, and I'm going to spend a little bit more time on this in another segment, but overspeed eccentrics. Now, this was made popular by Louis Simmons of Westside Barbell. And essentially, overspeed eccentrics, the way that I know of them is by using bands to increase the load. Now, how bands work, again, I'll spend more time with this in another segment. But what that bands do is they increase the total energy of, say, the system, so the load and you, because it's adding an additional source of energy. So you have potential energy, which is principally, think of it, gravity. You have kinetic energy, which is also movement, but then you have spring energy, which is created by the bands. And then following Newton's second and third laws of motion, all right, second law of motion is force equals mass times acceleration. So acceleration with a normal load is just gravity, but with the bands, you have increased acceleration. So more acceleration, more force produced. Also, the third law, opposite and equal reaction. So the more force applied downwards, the more force is going to be applied upwards concentrically. Now, these could be used for max strength or speed strength, just depending on the percentage and the load. And then I think this is a pretty interesting chart here on the right. So what this shows is that the amount of force that's applied or produced depending on velocity and the eccentric and concentric. So what you see is that a heavy load with a high eccentric velocity creates the most amount of force. So let's say in your first couple phases, your accumulation and intensification 1 phases, you have a slower eccentric to build more tissue resilience and eccentric strength. But then you transition to a faster eccentric with overspeed eccentrics to increase force and power development. All right. Again, I'm going to spend more time on this in another segment. Now, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Please, if you have any questions about eccentrics, just shoot me an email or send me a DM. And I hope that you guys really take away a lot from this this video and kind of realize that, all right, it's pretty important to focus on specific contractions or just emphasizing them slightly just by performing a slow eccentric with your movements. All right. All my young kids do slow eccentrics for, say, 4 seconds to improve technique. Move on to more, say, intermediate athletes, still doing slow eccentrics to increase strength. And then, say, more advanced athletes, we start to speed up the eccentric to create more force and at a faster rate. So I hope you guys enjoyed. And if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out. All right. I'll see you guys next week.